One day, concentration camp survivor and psychologist Dr. Viktor Frankl spoke to a woman who was admitted to his department after she tried to kill herself. The woman had lost an 11-year-old boy and was left alone to take care of her older son who was crippled from the effects of childhood paralysis. Frankl asked the woman, "How old are you?" And she says, 30. He says, "No, you are not 30, you are 80 now. You're sitting on your deathbed looking back on life. A life which was childless, but full of financial success and social prestige." And then he asked her to imagine what this situation would feel like. This is her exact response taken from the recorded tape. "Oh, I married a millionaire. I had an easy life full of wealth, and I lived it up. I flirted with men, I teased them, but now that I'm 80, looking back as an old woman, I can't really see what it was all for. Actually, I must say, my life was a failure." Then Frankl asked the woman to imagine herself as she was, but now on her deathbed. She says, "I wish to have children, and this wish was granted to me. One boy died, the other, the crippled one, would have been sent to an institution if I hadn't taken over his care. Though he is crippled and helpless, he is my boy. And so, I have made a fuller life possible for him. I have made a better human being out of my son." She burst out into tears when she said, "I can look peacefully back on my life, for I can say that my life was full of meaning, and that I have tried hard to fulfill it. I have done my best, the best for my son. My life was no failure." My name is Damian Barton, and today we're going to take a look at how we can find meaning in the worst of circumstances. To do this, we're going to be using one of my favorite books, and one that I cannot recommend enough, Dr. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl arrived at the concentration camps as a doctor. He had patients who he regularly saw. He was a dignified and well-respected medical professional. His free time was taken up by working on a manuscript for a textbook that would eventually become his magnum opus. But after Frankl stepped off that train, he ceased to be who he was. He was lined up and made to go left or right depending on whichever way the Nazi pointed. A decision which would ultimately decide who works as slave labor and who dies in the gas chambers. He was separated from his wife, who was taken to a different part of the camp. Then he was taken into a room where the Nazi guards made him throw all of his belongings into a pile, including the manuscript that he had spent his entire life working on. He was made to get rid of everything he owned and loved: his belongings, his clothes, his wedding ring. People were bargaining with the guards because they hadn't yet realized that they wouldn't be allowed to keep anything. He was taken into a room and stripped of his identity. They shaved his head to keep from lice infestations from breaking out at the camp. They tattooed his arm with the same number on his uniform, number 119104. That's who he was now, 119104. He was forced into a work detail where he marched miles to dig all day or lay down railway, which became increasingly difficult to do on a diet of watery potato soup and a small piece of bread. He said you could see when someone was going to die when their skin started to look like rags on their bones. They were starving, their body eating itself from the inside. He did this each day while spending the night sleeping on a bed that was really just a 6.5-foot baseboard that slept 9 men who had to lie on their sides to all fit. He had lost his status and respect. He had lost his wife. He had lost his life's work. He had lost his identity. Viktor Frankl had lost everything. What meaning could there possibly be to that life? It's such an absurd amount of suffering. What was the point of any of it? How could anybody find meaning in that kind of suffering? It's time for the... Viktor Frankl was in a very unique position. He was a psychologist pushed to the very limits of human suffering and lived to tell us how he made sense of it all. And in that way, he can provide us with an accurate and honest assessment of how to find meaning in suffering. A quick note, just because you can find meaning in suffering, it doesn't mean that you need to suffer to find meaning. As Frankl puts it, unnecessary suffering is just masochism. Dr. Frankl says that we can find meaning in our suffering by asking this one very important question. How did my suffering prevent the suffering of others? Frankl tells the story of a man who's fallen into a deep depression because his wife died. And Frankl says to the man, "What if you died first? What would have happened to her?" The man says, "Would have been terrible. She would have been a total wreck." Frankl says, "You see, such suffering has been spared for her. It was you who have spared this suffering, to be sure at the price that you now have to survive and mourn her." How is your suffering preventing the suffering of someone else? Are you staying up late nights to get your homework done so that you can get a good job and provide for your future children? Was it worth it to go through such a painful breakup in order to be able to apply the lessons you learned in that relationship to the person you're ultimately going to end up with? Frankl's suffering, him losing everything he owned, his life's work, and most importantly, every loved one he had led him to giving the world one of the most important insights into becoming a more complete human being. When we're able to find who we're helping with our suffering, we figure out why we're suffering. In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. Join us next week when we take an in-depth look at the 3 types of bravery, and we'll go over how you can become just a little bit braver. If you liked this episode and you want to learn more about Dr. Frankl's work, please check out Man's Search for Meaning. It's a quick read that packs a serious, serious punch. There's a lot of wisdom contained in those pages. If you liked this video and want to be notified anytime a new video is released, hit that subscribe button. Also, I'm pleased to tell you that the Barton Blueprint now has an official LinkedIn and Pinterest page. There's a bunch of extra content like infographics of some of the takeaway tips, as well as some fantastic mental health quotes by many of the most notable names in the field. The links are down in the description. Thank you for taking care of each other